Hi, I'm Carmen Alana Tibbets. Joining me in the studio today is this set of headless doll bodies that is destined to become a set of jackrabbits. Unlike most doll artists, I don't make stuffed fabric heads. I create heads out of layers of felted wool like this old sweater from the thrift store. This technique allows me to make heads of any shape that I want, anything from a hummingbird to a bighorn sheep to a jackrabbit. So in today's video, I'm going to show you the basics of my technique. Let's get started. Before we get started making heads, let's take a look at one of my typical heads. This is a jackrabbit that I'm working on. Obviously it's not finished. I haven't attached the ears here. But you can see the fabric covering and the eyes. And this is not a fabric shell that's been stitched and then stuffed. This is actually a solid wool head, although it still has a little bit of cush to it. And then this fabric is added and then stitched on last. So it's a little bit different technique than what most people do, and I use this because it gives me a lot of flexibility in creating different shapes of heads. By going from the inside out, I don't have to make a different pattern each time. I can just create the shape that I want with fabric sculpting, adding layers and layers of wool, and then doing a final covering of cloth. So before we actually make a head, let's take a look at what I use as the interior. I use felted wool sweaters. So if you go to thrift store, you're going to find plenty of these out there, and you can use just about anything you want. The only thing that you want to be careful is using sweaters that have a lot of three-dimensional texture. These are fine for the interior of the head, but even if you stretch them quite a bit when you're sewing them, there's still a lot of bumpiness here that might show through in the final layers of your head. So you want to save these for the interior, and then something nice and smooth and dense like this felted Shetland wool sweater for the final layers, which will be really nice to sew into and add that fabric covering. The first step in making a head is just cutting strips of wool, and you want to start out with something that's almost the length of your head, and however long, maybe 6 inches or so, and you're going to roll it up very firmly, and this is the first of the core. And then you're going to add another strip that's a little bit narrower. Again, wrap it pretty tightly. And then for a cylindrical head, like kind of the rabbit, I'm going to add another layer which is a little bit narrower, and then you can pin that in place if you want. And so what we're getting is kind of a triangular shape, and then I usually add a little bit just on the sides to make up the cheeks. So you can pin that, and then you're going to stitch, stitch, stitch. You could stitch through top and bottom all the way side to side if you want. It doesn't have to be pretty, you just want to hold those layers in place. So this is the core, and you do want to wrap it more tightly than I have here, but this is just for the video purposes. And it's as simple as that. So from this point, we're adding the layers that basically become the musculature of the head. You can think of this as the skull. So you want to make sure that this part of your skull is a little bit smaller than the final size of the head, because we're going to be adding at least 2 more layers plus the fabric exterior to this. Okay. I've stitched all those layers in place, and you can see the big stitches here. It doesn't have to be anything pretty because this is never going to show. So now we want to start covering, and you'll cut a strip of a nice smooth wool, and what we want to do is add something over the sides and over the top. And you may be wondering, well, what's the top and the bottom? Just sort of look at your head and it's going to be obvious. It's kind of funny how this works out. I never try to make a top or a bottom. It just sort of ends up where one is obviously the top and one is obviously the bottom. So what I like to do is add a layer on each side and then something over the top. And it's just as simple as putting your strip of wool, stretching a little bit, and then cutting it to shape. It doesn't have to match perfectly, because what we're going to do is sew it on. So, this will be one of the sides. I've got my pins here. and then something over the top. And then what you're going to do after pinning is you're going to take some big stitches through, but you want this to be a smooth seam. So what you're going to do is actually sew, instead of just butting this up and sewing those two pieces of fabric together, you actually want to dig into the wool quite a bit. You want to go in at least 1/4 of an inch in depth. And of course I didn't knot this, so it's not holding. But you want to go down, and you do want to pull it firmly. It doesn't have to be super tight, and in fact it probably shouldn't be, because if you do it really tight, what you're going to end up doing is creating a ridge there, and you do want some smoothness. So you're just going to do this and go all the way around wherever you have pieces of fabric. I've sewn on some layers of wool, so this was the first layer onto that wool core, and at this point I put the head on the body, so it's always a good idea to have your body first, and then I checked the sizing, and it turns out that this head is just a little bit too small. Now that's fine. If the head was too big, it's actually difficult to go back and make it smaller. Usually what I do is I just start all over again and make a smaller core. But in this case, this head is too small, so I can easily size up just by adding some more layers. So what I'm going to do to maintain the basic shape is I'm going to add something to build up the forehead here, and then another layer on the side, each side, and then another layer on top like this, and it's the same sort of thing. You just stitch all the way through, and then we'll check for sizing again, and then after I've sewn all of this, then we'll move on to adding the final layer of the exterior fabric. I've taken a few minutes to start covering one of the rabbit heads so you can see the entire process here. And I began with the bottom, and I cut out a piece of fabric that's going to cover the entire bottom with a little bit of overlap that I pull up taut, pin in place, and then stitch along the edges. And I don't worry too much about doing a very neat job here because this is all going to be covered by subsequent layers. Then, after I've done the bottom, I'm going to do the sides, and again I'll put this head down against the fabric, and then I'll just cut out pieces that follow the contour of the head. I'm very careful about getting the bottom shape correct, but I do want a little bit on the top and the back here because this needs to be pulled up again, pinned in place, and stitched very taut. The top and the back are going to get covered, but this bottom edge is the final edge of the head. I don't worry so much about having these raw edges and having little threads because these are mammal heads after all, so you can have something like this. It just looks like fur. If the fabric is pretty ravelly, and usually it's not because I'm usually using a felted wool, and I have longer threads like this here, you can just trim those off later and it'll be fine. But in any case, most of the time it just looks a little bit like whiskers or feathers if I'm doing birds, so it's okay. I don't worry about it. So here I'm going to add the final layer for the side, and I've chosen to use this particular fabric here to show you something that can happen. This is a wool gabardine, and even though it's been felted and shrunk quite a bit, it's very stable. It's a relatively thin fabric, thinner than what I usually use. And so what can happen in cases like that is as you pull these fabrics taut, you can see that line of the stitching that's underneath. And you don't want that. You want a nice smooth surface. So if that happens to you, there's a simple solution. You can just cut another piece of that fabric or another fabric, something like a flannel. You don't want anything too thick because it'll add a lot of dimension to the face. And just cut it a little bit smaller than the piece that you're going to attach. And then if you pin that into place and you pull it taut, you see that there is no line underneath anymore. So that's going to work out really well. So you would just pin this in place. In this case, I'm really only concerned about a couple of points. The nose, I want to make sure that these pieces meet in the front of the face there, because this becomes the lips and the mouth. So I want to make sure that those pieces meet up. And then I want this bottom edge to follow the line of the lower jaw. So I'm pinning, and I'm just holding it taut here. And then the top is going to overlap and go onto the top of the head, and the same with the back. So now what I'm doing is pulling this very, very tight, as tight as I can. And sometimes you'll have a fabric that's relatively stretchy, and it will contour to the surface of your felt head very nicely. So I would just stitch all around there with an overcast stitch, and it's going to look a little bit messy, but that's okay, because now we're going to go on to the next step. So here I have a rabbit head that's been covered, just like that one was, just set aside. So we did the sides, both sides are finished. The front meets up here at the nose, and it doesn't look perfect, but that's okay. Depending on the animal, I may add fabric later on to highlight the nose, but you know, sometimes I don't. I leave it as it is. So this final layer of fabric covers the top of the head and then wraps around to the back. Now you could do this in two pieces if you wanted to. It doesn't really matter. It's personal preference, but I usually do it as one piece. And so what I'll do is I'll lay the head down on the fabric, and then I very carefully cut along these edges, and I want this edge of the fabric to follow what would be the top of the snout, the top of the eye socket of the animal. So I do want to be very careful, and as you're doing this, you may find that the two sides are a little bit different, and that's okay. I actually find that a little bit of asymmetry in the face is good because it adds a little more personality. So then what we're going to do is we'll just pin this in place. It's the same old thing, and you want to get it taut. And something that may happen to you, and it depends on the fabric, is that as you're pinning and you're going around, you find that you have these big edges that just won't pin smooth. What do? Well, what I do is I just take a little tuck. So I'll just actually get that extra fabric and just make a little tuck, twist it just a little bit, and this one happens to be kind of a small one, and then pin it in place, and then I would sew around. Now this area here is where I'm going to attach the ears, so this won't show. This will be fine. Another good place to do it is at the lower jaw. You can do it right around where the eye sockets would be if you have a face with a lot of forehead contour. It doesn't matter, but I like to do it there in the ear area, and that's fine. And then from this point on, you just start sewing around, and I don't really do anything fancy here. Tuck that knot under, and I'm using my thumbnail to hold the edge in place, and I do try to take stitches that are perpendicular to the edge of the fabric. Now this is the one piece of fabric that's going to show the most, so I try to be neat, but I'm not really paranoid about it. And when you get to this tuck, you want to come up and bring the needle up towards the back of the tuck, and you want to take a couple little stitches along that tuck there. So what you're doing is you're digging in underneath, and that helps to keep it in place. And then you just continue sewing around, and nothing too complicated there. So that's what it would look like. And again, you may have a little bit of threads peeking out, but you can trim those later if you want to. Now you may find that once you're done with your head, it's just not enough. You need a little more facial contour. And in the case of rabbits, I like to have big cheeks. So what I do is I add an extra layer here, and I would stitch along the outside just like I showed you. And I do add some extra padding underneath, so something like flannel, again, if you have some flannel, or if you're using a thicker wool to cover, then a second layer of that wool cut a little bit smaller than the piece that you want to add, and then you would just pin that again and stitch it in place. So after you've done all this, you're almost done. The next step is eyes and ears. I'm finishing off with this head here, which is actually not a rabbit. This is destined to become an elk, but the shape of the head is fairly similar. So what we need to do now is add eyes, and I use an 8mm glass bead. These are readily available online, a number of sources. Just keep in mind that depending on the size of the head you use, you may need an eye that's a little bit larger or smaller than this. A lot of this is covered by a fabric eyelid, so I do start out with something bigger than what you might think you would need. So I have threaded a milliner's needle with doubled thread. This is upholstery thread. It's very thick and very strong. And I'm just going to take a stitch here to anchor the thread, and I'm using white so that you can see what's going on here. And I go all the way through the head. Oh, I guess I need to add one of the eyes first. Now you can use a doll needle if you want. You just want to make sure that it is going to fit through the hole of your bead, which is why I use a milliner's needle. And go all the way through to the other side, and then add your bead. And then back through. And what we're going to do is pull these pretty tight, and I'm rotating these beads so that not as much thread shows. The top and bottom of the eye is going to get covered by an eyelid, but still you want to make sure that not too much of that thread is going to show. And you can see here as I deform the head, because I'm pulling so taut, that it pulls the eyes into the side of the head, and that's what you want. You want something like that. And normally I would go through and do another pass with the thread, but I'm going to stop at this point. I'm just going to go ahead and take a stitch so that you can see the next step, which is attaching the eyelids. So I'm just going to anchor that, and I'll be honest, I'm probably going to cut that out and do a better job when I do it for real. I'm going to rotate the eyes a little bit. So we've got a little bit of that thread showing on top, but that's okay, because now what we're going to do is cover it with some eyelids. And I just use pieces of fabric that have been cut on the bias. It's kind of a quarter moon shape. It has a curve on the top and a curve on the bottom. And so you would just sort of place that over the top of the eye and onto the face, and play with it a little bit to find a placement that you like. And in this case I'm just going to pin it so that you can see what's going to happen. And it should cover all the way at the top. You see here that it's going to form a nice flat surface on the face. And then the bottom is a little bit less of a curve, more linear piece of fabric, but again it's cut on the bias, and then you would add that wherever you want to add it. And to position these permanently, I just run a thin little bead of glue along the top and the bottom. And this is one of the few instances where I do glue something onto the face. And you can really change the expression by moving these eyelids up and down. You can make your animal look very alert, sleepy, happy, just by changing the position of where those pieces of fabric go. So you can see the difference where you have something kind of, I don't know, maybe juvenile and pop-eyed here, or you have something here that looks quite a bit more realistic and much more expressive. So that's why I add those eyelids. It makes a big difference. So the last step is ears. And depending on my species, I'll have a little pattern. I usually make one new for each one because I lose them, I'll be honest. And in this case, it's just a layer of the fabric that I'm using for the head and a piece of thin silk. I'll trace around, right sides together, sew, trim it very close, and then turn it right sides out. I'll turn the edges under. And I don't use any fancy techniques here, as you can see. It's all just kind of forcing the fabric to do what you want it to do. And then I'll take a little bit of a tuck to give it a little bit of an ear opening here. And then it's just as simple as positioning it on the head where you want it to go. And in this case, elk actually have ears that kind of come out the side. And then you can just sort of pin those where you want them. And you can fiddle with it a little bit and change it even quite a bit when it's sewing. And then I'll just stitch with a slip stitch around, and then I'm done. So that would be pretty much it for my elk head. And as you can see, the process isn't complicated. It definitely takes a little bit of practice, but once you get used to it, you can make just about any kind of head that you want. And I think that the end results are pretty amazing. I like these guys a lot. Hope you give it a try. Thanks for stopping by.